appear to be designed for intermediate-range ballistic missiles, and thus capable of striking most of the major cities in the Western Hemisphere.
The year was 1962, and it is remembered as the year the world almost spiraled into nuclear war. With the potential to obliterate the Western Hemisphere, nuclear weaponry was in the hands of two superpower nations, the United States and the Soviet Union. Urgently trying to find a solution to the crisis, President John F. Kennedy assembled the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or ExComm. When an intense conflict arose within the group of advisors, a compromise was needed to enable a peaceful end to the crisis, restore diplomatic relations, and protect the lives of millions. After breaking diplomatic ties with Cuba and unsuccessfully attempting to overthrow its communist leader Fidel Castro in the Bay of Pigs invasion, tensions between the US and Cuba rose. Castro asked Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev for support.
He was desperate because he was afraid after the Bay of Pigs that his regime wasn't going to last.
Khrushchev was anxious to gain an advantage over the US and happily agreed by secretly placing nuclear missiles in Cuba aimed at the United States. When word reached the United States of these missiles, it marked the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Once President Kennedy learned of the missiles, he formed ExComm to help him decide the U.S. response to the threat. ExComm's decision could lead to success, or it could lead to war, deaths, and devastation.
Because everyone was afraid that a nuclear war was going to result. And there was good reason to be fearful of that, because a nuclear war was certainly possible.
This critical decision led to a clear conflict within ExComm between two ideas of a response: a nuclear airstrike and a naval blockade. Known as Hawks, supporters of the airstrike argued that it would rebuild their reputation after the Bay of Pigs failure, and most importantly, it would remove the missiles in Cuba and eliminate the threat to the United States.
I just don't see any other solution except direct military intervention right now.
They saw the Cuban Missile Crisis, the fact that Russia was bringing weapons onto the island, as a valid reason to attack the government.
Critics believed an airstrike would lead to retaliation and mutually assured destruction, a nuclear war that would result in the deaths of millions of American citizens.
The decision to use any kind of a nuclear weapon, even the tactical ones, presents such a risk of getting out of control so quickly that...
Alternatively, supporters of the blockade, known as Doves, argued that a blockade would send a clear message to other nations and prevent the further assembly of weapons in Cuba. On the other hand, a blockade could anger Cuba because it would stop all ships headed towards the nation, cutting off all imports regardless of their purpose. Cuba could view a blockade as hostile and then would have reason to attack the US. Because a blockade would not address the missiles already assembled in Cuba, the US would still be very vulnerable. Once faced with this apparent conflict, the Hawks and Doves began to argue and debate their sides. Members presented their arguments, listing the benefits and downfalls of each option. The ideal option would benefit the US and, most importantly, avoid a nuclear war, the prospect of which was growing heavily day by day. Nuclear war was so imminent that even children were trained to be prepared in case of the approval to fire.
When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered.
Overall, a compromise was needed to solve this conflict between the Hawks and Doves before it escalated, or the United States would be forced to engage in a war they desperately needed to avoid.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack requiring a full retaliatory response.
The debates gradually grew more and more one-sided, and largely due to Kennedy's staunch support of the blockade, it eventually came to a consensus that the blockade was the better option. This was not final, as there were still many concerning arguments against it. It was clear that ExComm needed to devise a compromise that addressed the concerns of the Hawks while retaining the benefits of the blockade. Building off of the blockade, ExComm members suggested ideas that would detract from the downfalls of the blockade and eventually settled upon a compromise. On October 22, 1962, President Kennedy announced that the United States would initiate a naval quarantine.
A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
This compromise would be similar to the naval blockade, but it would not be viewed as hostile. The threat to the U.S. would be dismantled. No lives would be lost, and the United States would be able to keep both power and peace. After the announcement of the naval quarantine, the U.S. anxiously awaited the response of the Soviet Union. Government officials informed the Organization of American States and the UN Security Council of ExComm's compromise of the naval quarantine. The quarantine was eventually approved, and the Soviet vessels were turned away. Outwardly, Khrushchev criticized the action, but the peaceful compromise avoided a war, and he allowed it to pass while breathing a sigh of relief.
The effect was tremendous relief on everybody's part.
Officials from both nations met, and eventually, an agreement was reached between the two nations that formally ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the intense crisis, countries with nuclear power realized that diplomacy and agreements would need to be carried out in order to control the use of nuclear weaponry. In 1963, the Moscow-Washington phone hotline was established to ensure quick communication in the case of another nuclear crisis. Numerous treaties were signed following the crisis. The Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963 prohibited nuclear testing in the atmosphere, outer space, or underwater to keep the environment free from the harmful effects of nuclear substances. In the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, President Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon discussed with the Soviet Union how they could limit the development of nuclear weapons in order to minimize the chances of war. At the end of these talks, both nations signed the Interim Agreement on the Limitation of Strategic Defensive Arms, as well as the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons enforces nuclear disarmament. Signed by 191 leaders, it remains one of the largest nuclear disarmament treaties in the world. These treaties consistently emerge in national debates and disputes with nuclear weaponry. The most well-known and current example is North Korea, which is developing its nuclear arsenal and becoming more of a threat. These treaties, formed following the compromise, are widely referenced and utilized to manage nuclear weaponry. The naval quarantine played a key role in averting a potentially disastrous nuclear war and saved the lives of millions of Cuban, Soviet Union, and American citizens. ExComm's conflict between an airstrike and a naval blockade split the committee in two, and they spent nearly 2 weeks arguing and debating over a response. Both the Hawks and the Doves had compelling arguments, but if ExComm's conflict spiraled out of control, it could end the lives of billions and destroy world diplomacy. The compromise of the naval quarantine not only allowed for peace, but also sparked effects that continue to shift international ties and politics and play a key role in global and governmental issues today.
Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere. And we hope around the world, God willing, that goal will be achieved.